Good afternoon. It's always challenging to do a session right after the lunch. And I still see people flowing into, but I've got a lot of content, so I'm going to get started. So I'm going to talk about the laws of identity in the era of ubiquitous identity. How many of you guys actually know Kim Cameron's The Laws of Identity? Could you raise your hand? It's about 30%, I guess. This is one of the fundamental principles, hypothesis put forward by Kim Cameron and Identity Gang back in 2005. Yeah, that's almost 20 years ago. But it still remains quite pertinent. It's valid. And although it's got a bunch of missing things with, for example, back in 2005, we didn't have smartphones, for example, right? So there can be things that need to be added on to it, but those 7 of them stand still pretty well. So what I'm going to do today is first touch on the basics of identity and digital identity, and then explain the privacy principles. That's OECD Privacy Principles and ISO 29100 Privacy Principles, which I happen to be the editor of that later document as well, and do some mapping between the laws of identity and the privacy principles, and start evaluating the how valid they are right now, even now, or what kind of other considerations we need to put. So, identity. This is an identity conference. It's Identiverse, right? We talk about identity a lot, but seldom we actually define what identity is. And what I have got it here in front of you is one version of definition of identity. It's slightly modified from the version which Kim Cameron wrote in his paper, but it's basically the same. It's a set of claims made by one subject about itself or another subject. And therefore, digital identity is a set of claims made by one subject about itself or another subject digitally. Now, digitally means structured and machine readable. It doesn't mean something that you scanned. For example, in my passport, I've got my name, my date of birth, and so on and so forth on the sheet of paper, but scanning that does not make it digital identity. It's just a digitized identity. My passport is an e-passport actually, so it has got the smart card in it as well, and that one actually has the structured and machine readable digital identity in it. It's X509 format. So that's the relation between the identity and the digital identity. And we do actually use identity a lot in our life. In this picture, I have, me or Alice on your left, and the friend on the right, and the context surrounding the relationship between Alice and her friend. And to make a good relationship, first she projects what she wants to be seen as, her identity, to her friends. Now, how does she do that? Well, she lays claims about herself, like not just through the name or something, but through her activity, through what she wears, and so on and so forth. And hopefully, she hopes that she's going to be regarded by or recognized by her friends just like that, which unfortunately doesn't happen. the friends, recognize her as a little bit different from what she wanted to project. And there's going to be a delta or difference between what she intended to project and what she was actually recognized. And that delta is the source of interpersonal issues or relationship issues. And what we do from day to day is try to minimize that difference by projecting yet another or yet more claims to the friends here in this context. And there are many contexts. So this is the context of friends, but there are professional contexts as well. So, she wanted to look very active, and maybe she likes anime or something like that to their friends, but she wanted to be seen really serious and, responsible in her professional context to her boss. And to do that, she projected different claims to her boss. Now, we shouldn't mix the context, or we shouldn't mix the claims which was supposed to be available in one context to another. For example, her boss might be a kind of person who is prejudiced against, anime or something like that. In which case, she doesn't want to be, known to be the, anime lover or otaku or something like that. But the moment that information leaks into the professional context, the difference or delta between what she wanted to project to her boss and what she is going to be recognized by her boss becomes larger, and she becomes unhappier. There's a study done by University of Harvard over 70 years. It's a very good TED video. I've put the link there, so you might want, if you haven't seen it, you might want to see it as well, or watch it as well. But at the end of the day, it just says good relationship keep us happier and healthier, period, right? And how do we keep a good relationship? Yes, by projecting ourselves and by minimizing the difference between what I recognize as myself, that's identity, and what I am recognized as. And in the digital context, we do it electronically. Typically, we provide our claims through identity providers. Now, identity provider here is a very abstract term. It can live on the cloud, or it can live on your phone. And when it lives on your phone, it's called wallet, right? And so I get authenticated to the identity provider and select what attributes or what claims I'm going to share. And I create something called authenticated identity and provide it to the right parties. Now, that claim can be completely self-attested, or self-attested claims only, or you may want to provide third-party attested claims as well. On the left-hand side, I have added two N entities called claims provider 1 to N. They each are authoritative sources of some information. For the registered name, legal name, maybe government name register is the authoritative source, while for my university graduation record, my university happens to be the University of Western Ontario, Canada, is the authoritative source. For my employment or for my affiliation in the OpenID Foundation, then OpenID Foundation is going to be the authoritative sources. So there are going to be many authoritative sources. It's never going to be the one. And this, we are living in this kind of distributed identity world. And in the context of verifiable credentials, these claims provider, which is a very abstract term, on their lingo, it's called issuer. The identity provider is called wallet, and relying parties is called verifier. And each of them actually maintains identity on their own, according to the identity lifecycle model. And we often just think about the happy path, but it is also extremely important to look at the anomaly cases, like on the lower left side, I've got suspended state. That path is actually really important, especially the reactivation path. That's going to be really important, and that's often is the key to the success of the identity management system. There's a system called InfoCard, which shipped with, I think, Windows 7 or something like that. It was a wallet-based system, but it didn't really fly because this leg or the exception flow actually didn't work well. Only Mike Jones spoke in EIC that only 3% of people could actually return to the normal path from the exception cases, which is not good. And then ubiquitous identity, what's that? Well, according to Kupinga-Cole definition back in 2013, it's a single digital identity that can be used across multiple applications and devices. So there's going to be K devices, which hosts M verses, which hosts N applications, right? And it's a multivariate environment, and you have to be able to use source your identity from a single digital identity. I mean, it's not saying that using the single digital identifier across those contexts. You'll probably be using different persona and things like that, but you should be having the one single core digital identity from which those personas can be derived. And that actually implies that it has to be cloud-based because it's multi-device. It cannot be sourced in single device. And since it's multi-verse, multi-location, interface needs to be standardized. Otherwise, if it's the mesh of proprietary interfaces, the combination just explodes. It's going to be K times M times N. And it's unrealistic to build something like that. Also, because it's going to be used in very different context and setting, we have to think about the optimized user interface for each use cases that a user can relate. It has to be a ceremony that user can relate to, but in some context, like in the metaverse Google case, you probably won't be able to input password or complex password in that kind of environment. And we have to think about what we can do there, and then that user interface needs to be relatable in the, for example, PC context or smartphone context or something like that. We have to figure it out. I don't think we have yet, but that's the implication. All right, so that was the basics of digital identity. Now I'm going to get to the OECD and OECD Privacy Principles and guidelines. And the QR code and the link provides you the location for the download of those documents. I'm hoping that everybody knows OECD Do you guys know OECD? Well, it's less than what I thought. So OECD actually stands for Organizations of Economic Cooperation and Development. It creates legal instruments, they call it legal instruments, upon which member countries are bound to implement the in the policy or law in one way or another, and progress is going to be monitored. So in the OECD, they form agreement. About 30 countries forms agreement, and then that government actually implements that, and OECD monitors the progress. So that's the kind of mechanism they are using. And one of the most prominent case for that is GDPR. So OECD privacy guidelines were set in 1980. Took quite a while to actually precipitate into GDPR. It went through a number of iterations, but I think it was 2018, right? And then in the case of Japanese Act on Personal Information Protection, it was put in place in 2003, and then amended in 2015, I think, and then again in 18 and 21, something like that. Now, so OECD privacy guidelines is the mandate to the governments, and it's actually hard for industry to take it as is. So there's ISO standard, ISO IC 29100 privacy framework, which takes the OECD privacy guidelines as input and lays out a bunch of requirements. And I put other numbers like 29134, 29184, and so on and so forth. They are the sub-documents, which goes into more details about what 29100 says. And one of the most important one happens to be 27701, PIMS, Privacy Information Management System, which is the implementation or instantiation of Article 42 certification of GDPR. And this ISO privacy framework was an input to OpenID Connect as well. When we were building OpenID Connect, we actually took that document seriously and made sure that where it is relevant, put the control, technical control in place. So what does OECD Privacy Principle says? Collection limitation principle. In GDPR parlance, it's the data minimization, right? And then data quality principles. Data quality, there's a lot of text. Don't bother to read it now. It's for you guys to download later and read it over again. So data quality principle is that if the data is wrong, incorrect, it's going to give privacy impact to that person. So the data quality is also important. And purpose specification, you have to specify what you're going to use that personal data for. And you cannot use it to the secondary purpose unless you get opt-in or explicit consent from the users. I heard that in the United States, the biometrics-based system became a subject of some interesting discussions last year. And if I'm correct, this, the purpose specification was one of the issues down there. Use limitation. So the personal data collected must be used as specified in the purpose and nothing else. And the security safeguard principles is that you can't just put the collected personal information in the open internet. You have to put the appropriate safeguard controls. And the openness principle is that you have to be as an organization, you have to be open on how you are going to be treating the data. And the individual participation principle is that you have to actually give them the access, at the end of the day, on what data they are collecting and what kind of processing they are doing. And the accountability principle is that the organization has to be able to explain what they're doing with the evidence. And if somebody else checks the evidence and finds out that the explanation is actually false, they have to take responsibility for that. So that's the accountability principle. So that's the OECD privacy guidelines in very, very high level view. And I'll go to the ISO 29100 privacy framework. Most of the ISO specifications, standards, are not free, but this one, as it is a very fundamental document, is freely available. You can go to the QR code and download it. It's a zip file, and you have to actually unarchive it, but it's available. And it's got, 7 chapters in it, I think. And in the main chapters, there are a whole bunch of other legalese things, but it explains in the beginning, it explains the relationship between PII principle, PII controller, PII processor, and third party. And then it goes on to how interactions happens. And it explains 8 scenarios and the role of the actors. And it explains how you can recognize PII. Sometimes PII comes into your organization in a non-obvious way, like as a metadata to Microsoft Word file. And then it talks about privacy safeguarding requirements, and then it explains what privacy policies are. Actually, there are 2 types of it. Internal policy, which we call as privacy policy in ISO 29100 context. That's the policy that the organizations actually have to adhere to. And then privacy notice, which has to be publicly available about what PII they're going to be collecting, how they are going to be used, that's purpose, and so on and so forth. And then it talks about what kind of privacy controls are available. And finally, it talks about 29100 privacy principles, which there are 11 of them. Consent, first one is a consent and choice. You remember that there was no consent in the OECD Privacy Principles explicitly. They are in the text, but in 29100 we have pulled it out as one of the most important principle. And then purpose, legitimacy, and specification. You remember that in OECD principles, it was just saying purpose, specification. We have put legitimacy, right? The purpose, just stating purpose is not good enough. The purpose actually has to be legitimate, right? And then we decomposed what we usually call data minimization to the collection limitation and data minimization. Collection limitation is you have to limit what you collect. And data minimization is that for each processing steps, you have to minimize the data that you are going to be processing. And use, retention, and disclosure limitation, hopefully that's self-explanatory. And accuracy and quality, we have talked before. Openness, transparency, and notice, yes, we have already talked about. And individual participation and access, the same. Accountability, I have talked. And information security, the same. And the privacy compliance program, which wasn't there in the OECD principles, but from the organization point of view, I mean industry point of view, that's very important. Otherwise, you won't actually be demonstrate the accountability. And if you're interested, that's the mapping between the ISO privacy principles and OECD privacy guidelines. And OpenID Connect was created this ISO IC 29100 in mind. For example, for consent and notice, we have prompt equal consent that forces the consent screen to come up. For purpose legitimacy and specification, there's a facility parameter called policy URL actually, through which the relying party provides privacy notices, so that the OpenID provider can actually pull that down and make it available at a later date, because the relying party may change it at any time, right? So the OpenID provider can actually stand on the side of the users to demonstrate that that was not the thing the user actually consented. And collection limitation, OpenID Connect is a selective disclosure protocol. It can do a very granular disclosure using parameter called claims. Also, it does PPID, standing for pairwise pseudonymous identifier. It's identifier, different it generates the identifier for that relying party, so that the relying parties cannot correlate to each other, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to go over everything here, because that's going to take too much time. But if you're interested, you can reach out to me to ask about other privacy facilities in OpenID Connect as well. And I just talked about the PPID, which is about linkability. And we, as an industry, tend to be very loose about what we talk about unlinkable, and what is unlinkable. But it is actually a pretty difficult concept. And we always have to specify who's the adversary and who's the target entity when we talk about unlinkability. And in 27551, which I'm one of the author, we have identified 8 notions of unlinkability. So when you talk about unlinkability or anonymity or something like that, please make sure that you know which one you are actually talking about. By the way, this is just high level. The standard itself, 27551, has mathematical definition of these unlinkabilities as well. All right, so we are now prepared. The laws of identity. So mapping laws of identity and privacy principles, they map pretty well, but not everything can be mapped to each other. So that's my read of the relationship. And with that in mind, let's go over each laws. The first one is user control and consent. It maps directly the consent and choice in 29100. It says technical identity system must only reveal information identifying a user with the user's consent. So, OpenID Connect does it, policy URL and, prompt equal consent and all sort of facilities. And OpenID for VP does provide a selective disclosure as well. But the consent here is a very difficult concept. Consent under information asymmetry, which generally is, the organization has much more information than the user, is very difficult. It's usually not really a consent. And for that, to consider something like this, we always have to think about human capability limitation, right? And with that, human is not always capable of making real consent. And we, for example, for children, don't have the capability for the legal consent, or elderly people may have limited capability to do so as well, right? And the over-consent is a very well-known tendency. Do you guys remember the Cambridge Analytica case, right? And people put blame on Facebook, but I have to make note that those information were actually provided with user consent. So that's a difficult problem, right? And then collection by observation in device context poses challenges when we talk about consent. So, the ubiquitous identity is very closely related to the device context. And so if we stick onto the consent model, it poses a challenge. I'm not giving out the answer to how to cope with it. I'm just sharing my concerns, and my hope is that we can come to some kind of solution eventually. But if you've got ideas, please come by and let's discuss. Second law is minimum disclosure for constrained use, and it's the solution which discloses the least amount of identifying information and best limits its use is the most stable long-term solution. Yeah. So as I told you, OpenID Connect has claims parameters, and OpenID for VP has presentation definition parameter for this purpose. So that's kind of good, but again, information asymmetry makes it difficult to judge for a person whether the request actually is complying to collection limitation or data minimization. And how do we cope with it? And in the metaverse-like context, it becomes even harder. Linking through observation may become much easier than in the traditional context. Like carrying the same NFT bag, for example, may be good enough to actually link two avatars in two different metaverse. Or your voice can be a very good identifier. So I've been doing some research on that, and you're going to be identified pretty quickly, right? So that's a challenge. Justifiable parties. Digital identity system must be designed so that the disclosure of identifying information is limited to parties having necessary and justifiable place in a given identity relationship. Can a user judge if that party is justifiable or not? Probably not. Then who judges the justifiability? That's a good question, and we have to answer, especially in the wallet kind of context. Directed identity is talking about PPID. It has to be a PPID for the users, and the organization side, the data collecting organization side, have to actually provide an omnidirectional identifier, the persistent identifier. That can be done. Well, at least in OpenID Connect context. It's a little bit challenging in wallet context. And I can go on talking about that for an hour. I'm not going to do it, but please sink in and think why it is hard. Pluralism of operation and technologies. So we are not going to precipitate in one single trust framework, one single identity protocol, one single credential format. No, not in the foreseeable future. So universal identity system must channel and enable the interworking of multiple identity technologies run by multiple identity providers. So there has been a competition, and that is a good thing. Competition among the provider generally makes it much more efficient in the market. And they usually support multiple protocols, and standardized interface is a must, otherwise only the largest will remain. And human integration. The universal identity metasystem must define the human user to be a component of the distributed system, integrated through ambiguous human-machine communication mechanism offering protection against identity attacks. And this is something which we often forget about. We don't put human being as a system component in the cycle. And phishing is just one example of that. And failure for the user to go through the ceremony or the mechanisms is another. We see a lot of those. And when you're designing your new identity system, please make sure that human integration is there. Don't put too onerous processing or user interface to the users. If they can go wrong, they will go wrong. And the last role is consistent experience across context. The unifying identity metasystem must guarantee its users a simple, consistent experience while enabling separation of context through multiple operators and technologies. So it's talking about ceremonies that Jan Glazer was talking about. Why do we we pay by touch these days, in all sorts of places, and that ceremony is understood as payment. That's why normal human being, Homo sapiens, can do that. If the consistent user experience is not available across context, it's going to get really hard for people to understand, and it's going to be the barrier for adoption. But this is a bit challenging if we think about multi-device, multi-verse context, as form factors and so on and so forth are different. And so we may end up with a different user experience in different contexts, but then to be a consistent experience, we have to devise a mechanism which has the intuitive link among the different ceremonies optimized to the devices. In the case of OpenID Connect, we do IDP, chooser, username, credential, consent flow, right? For OpenID, for VP, it's kind of TBD right now, but it's probably wallet chooser, credential chooser, consent kind of flow. But then that's too abstract, and we have to actually put a pretty good linkable, relatable, intuitive user interface into that. Okay, so that was laws of identity, and to close, I want to introduce yet another document which was not available at the time of the submission of the talk. It's OECD draft recommendation on the governance of digital identity. It's just draft. We don't know where it's going to go, whether it's going to be mandated to the government. I hear rumors that it may be challenging as well, but we'll see. But this document is really good. It's short and sweet and very consistent, and it talks about equities and and ethics and things like that as well. So when it's a pretty good guidance when we are designing identity system. So, don't wait for the government to start regulating, but just read it and think about, what you can actually take, what you can actually learn from this document. All right, so that's my presentation, and we've got like 10 minutes for, well, actually 5 minutes, I don't know, for the questions. Is there any questions? Did I completely lose you? Or did I do such a good job that I explained everything perfectly? Yeah, definitely. And so I think the slides are going to be available through the app, or if you come to my blog, I'm going to put it in my blog as well. I'll announce that through my Twitter feed and the YouTube channel as well. So, use whatever the platform you use usually, and you will find the slides. Anything else? Yeah, it's actually, the light is right into my eye, and I really can't see that. Yes, Nishant.
When doing the mapping to Kim's original laws, did you find...
Could you speak up, please?
When you did the mapping to Kim's original laws, did you find any that was particularly hard to map or that had a certain deviation?
I mean, mapping what?
When you were mapping to the original laws that Kim had and the nature of ubiquitous identity, did it change anything? Was there any place where the mapping didn't quite fit and you felt...
Mapping was okay, but then, what I found was the new challenges coming in, right? So, for example, in 2005, basing things on consent seemed to be very obvious, right? But in the device context, and, sheer number of the cases that we are confronting each day, basing purely on the consent is becoming really challenging. So that's what I have kind of identified in each cases, right? So yes, the mapping was not hard, but each laws reveal that in the new reality has challenges to be solved. Yes.
So picking up on what Nishan just said, if one would need to rewrite what Kim wrote 1.5 decades ago to make it fit to our current environment, I would assume it would be not the 7, but like the 70 laws of identity. Am I correct?
Hopefully not 70, but certainly not 7, I think. I don't know. My gut feeling is that it's going to be like, 15 or something like that, yeah. But then, at the same time, the law still holds, but how to apply or how to implement the law is becoming more and more challenging. Yes?
You mentioned some of the principles, I think it's in the OECD guidelines about informed consent, permitted use, things like this. How is that enforced?
So, that's one of the challenge I identified, right? I'm in the opinion that we actually cannot really get a meaningful consent except for very obvious cases. The consent actually has to be done with the full information. But given that there's such a huge information asymmetry between the individual and corporations, I'm not sure if that, pressing the button actually counts as the consent. So UK ICO, before Brexit, by the way, was advising that among the 6 lawful bases of the GDPR, it's in Article 6. The A is the first one is consent, but they were advising not to use it if possible. Use other things, right? Because consent is hard. And I kind of agree. And so in OpenID Connect, we are saying consent, but these days we are trying to avoid the word consent. Just grant or something like that instead. Whether that forms a consent or not can be determined only after the fact. And it's almost impossible from the protocol point of view. Any other questions? Maybe the last one? Yes?
Could you reiterate why consent may be more difficult in the wallet scenario as opposed to the OpenID Connect?
No, I was not saying that consent is more difficult in the wallet scenario, but there can be wallets on the phone or wallets on the cloud, and how much wallets provider actually gets into the process makes things a little bit different. And when it becomes a wallet in the cloud where the wallet provider actually takes responsibility, it's not different from the OpenID Connect OpenID provider at all then. So I can't make that kind of generalization. But if it's the user, completely on the user, right? The responsibility is on the user because the information asymmetry is so huge that getting meaningful consent actually is going to be challenging. Well, in the case of, I'll give you an example of OpenID provider called SingPass, the Singaporean government OpenID provider. When they are onboarding running parties, they evaluate if they are legitimate parties, and they evaluate the information request and evaluate if that claims request is actually data minimized or collection minimized, and exposes the users only to those legitimate requests. And in that kind of setting, the consent becomes more easier, right? So it's like assisted consent. And I'm in the opinion that even in the wallet context, we actually probably need to do something like that. But it's not really discussed right now, and that's one of the concerns that I have right now. I mean, giving control to the user is good. Pushing liability to the users is not good. Okay, with that, I think I'm time up. Did you raise your hand, or? Oh yeah, please.
Just to add to the consent debate, in the UK now, the new framework is quoting the term user agreement. I was deliberately using that term, so it's not using the term consent because of the ICO advice that you referred to. So a lot of identity providers are using contract or legitimate interest, but nonetheless, they have to get a user agreement to what they're doing. How a user agreement works is fairly woolly, but it needs to involve an explicit statement of what's happening and what data is going to be shared. So it's like consent, but legally it's not.
Yeah, privacy notice is always required. But having exposed the user for the privacy notice and having the user click on agree that's just agreement, and it's not, we are not sure if that's a consent. So that's the point, right? Yeah. All right, so with that, thank you very much for coming to this session just after lunch.